I think it's time to start our next panel, which is entitled Narratives of Wartime Famines Between Individual and Collective Memory. I warmly welcome our speakers. Yeah, what is important that that we will have one presenter online and two on the spot, and there are only just 3 of us, so I hope that we will have time for discussion after the presentations. So let me introduce you our first presenter, who will be Alexandra Preit-Schopf. She holds a position as a postdoc assistant for contemporary history at the University of Klagenfurt, and currently she works on a research project on the multi-layered impact of the Russian emigration on anti-communism in the interwar Europe. And I think that her presentation will give us an insight into this research. And the title of her presentation is Preserved Witness, Forgotten Memory, ? The Great Famine of 1921-22 in the Writings of Russian Emigres. Please.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. I will start with a quote straight away. As early as the end of June 1921, the streets and squares of Kazan were packed by the starving crowd. Starving people were literally lying everywhere with their children and their sick. They could be shot but not removed. After a while, some of them died in the same places on the street. A human corpse became a familiar appearance, and it no longer frightened anyone. This quote is extracted from a personal letter to the politician Pavel Milyukov, who lived in exile in Paris from 1920 onwards. He preserved this distressing testimony in his book Russia Today and Tomorrow, which dedicates an extensive chapter to the Great Famine of 1921-22 in Soviet Russia that resulted in the loss of approximately 5 to 8 million lives. As one of many intellectuals who sought refuge in France following the Bolshevik takeover, Milyukov was part of a massive exodus that followed the October Revolution and the ensuing civil war. Over 1.5 million people migrated to various European cities, including, above all, Paris, Berlin, Munich, Prague, Belgrade, and other cities. And its social composition varied widely as well, encompassing ultranationalist, far-right figures, monarchist aristocrats, bourgeois liberals like Milyukov, as well as social democrats. Many of them were from the middle and upper classes of their native society and belonged to its intellectual elites. And consequently, some of them, such as former politicians, journalists, or writers, quickly asserted themselves as outspoken anti-Bolshevik voices in their places of exile. In this context, it is crucial to note that the October Revolution profoundly impacted all of Europe, instilling immediate fear and unease. As anti-communism in general became a central political driving force during the European interwar period, Russian as well as Ukrainian émigré publicists, serving above all as first-hand informants, easily found readership. They published newspapers, newspaper articles, essays, pamphlets, political papers, novels, in Russian, but also in French, in English, in German, etc., in which they harshly criticized the Soviet dictatorship and all kinds of aberrations in Soviet Russia and the later Soviet Union. Nevertheless, their contribution to the intellectual mindset of the time and their discursive impact have not yet been extensively researched, and their publications have largely been forgotten today. This is particularly true when it comes to the democratically minded camp of emigration, and among them also many Jewish publicists. Therefore, my paper aims to take a closer look at this political camp and to ask what role the famine of 1921-22 played here, how politically activist authors like Milyukov made reporting on the famine part of their general anti-Bolshevik agitation, and which memories they preserved via this agitation. I will give you now a short overview on the famine of 1921-22. It was above all caused by bad harvests and a drought in conjunction with 7 years of economic and social disturbance brought about by the First World War, the October Revolution and the ensuing civil war of 1918 to 21. Before, there had been already a large-scale famine during the first years of the Civil War between 1918 and 1920, to which historians have not paid much attention yet. The methods of war communism, including confiscation and collectivization, had weakened rural communities, while the White Armies were still active in some parts of the country. Especially affected, as you can see here as well on the map, were the regions around the Volga and Ural rivers, some parts of Ukraine and southeastern borderlands of Russia. The Soviet-Ukrainian dissident Viktor Kravchenko, for instance, describes at one point the desperate situation in his widely received bestseller I Chose Freedom, published in 1947 in New York. I quote, "In the summer of 1921, the famine was in full tide, and with it the brother of famine, epidemic typhus. After the long years of war and civil strife, we faced hunger in its most elementary and cruel forms. The drought was centered in the Volga regions, but its skeleton fingers reached out grimly beyond the Dnieper. The area of most intense famine coincided in a general way with the area of most intense civil war. There are no words to describe the suffering and horror. Men eyed every living thing, horses, dogs, cats, house pets, with greedy despair. Stories of peasants eating their own dead became more frequent, and unhappily they were often true. All of us were too deeply concerned with our own survival to notice or at bottom to care about the others." As you can see here, in addition to general deadening and apathy, Kravchenko also mentions cases of cannibalism during the famine, as we heard before also for the Holodomor. According to the historian Orlando Figes, for instance, thousands of such cases were reported, with the number of cases that were never reported certainly even higher. Already by the end of July 1921, the full dimensions of the catastrophe and the Bolshevik government's inability to address it became apparent to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and appeals asking for international famine relief were issued. On 20 August 1921, the Soviet government signed an agreement authorizing Herbert Hoover's American Relief Administration, ARA, to begin wide-scale aid, and a similar agreement with the Norwegian diplomat Fridtjof Nansen, head of the newly founded International Committee for Russian Relief, 1 week later. By the time operations peaked in August 1922, more than 11 million people were receiving food aid through foreign organizations. However, ideological and political factors complicated the situation, as the Bolshevik regime was still fragile and unrecognized by most Western governments. Conservative foreign politicians, as well as several emigres, were skeptical or openly hostile to the idea of supporting Soviet Russia with food, warning that this would only stabilize the new regime. Others, however, saw the famine relief as an opportunity for provoking pro-Western attitudes among the population and increasing the chance of a regime change. In fact, and interestingly, almost all relief help came from parties who were opposed to the Bolshevik ideology, which explains why communist leaders deeply mistrusted foreign organizations and feared a counter-revolution in humanitarian disguise. Nevertheless, they realized the benefit of accepting Western aid. In mid-1922, however, Soviet leaders decided to export grain, although there was every indication that the famine would continue, and there was no assurance that the ARA would remain in the country. It turned out that about 3.5 million persons who needed food support received none, while the Soviet authorities exported grain in amounts that were more than all the food used in foreign relief operations. This action influenced the decision of the ARA to stop their relief efforts in July 1923. I'm coming now to the emigres' perspectives. Despite their profound distrust of the Bolshevik regime, especially liberal, democratically minded emigres swiftly responded to appeals emerging from Soviet Russia, calling for help on a humanitarian basis. Above all, they raised awareness via different publications, since they saw in the famine also a media opportunity to highlight the injustices and grievances of the Soviet regime in general. In their view, it was not drought or the war, but the Bolsheviks themselves that had killed Russian industry and robbed the agricultural population to the point where the famine became inevitable. Envisioning a democratic Russia after the collapse of Bolshevism, they hoped that the global attention generated by the famine would hinder trade with and official recognition of the Bolshevik government, contribute to its diplomatic isolation, and encourage a regime change. Their writings on the famine drew on a variety of sources, including eyewitness accounts and private letters, as well as on official Bolshevik reports and newspapers, reports from the American Relief Administration and other international organizations. To support their argument, they frequently mobilized the most horrific images, trying to arouse empathy, pity, or solidarity among their readers. Their texts are therefore not only compilations of contemporary testimonies, but also important sources for the history of emotions. In this context, it is helpful to draw, for example, on concepts from historians such as William Reddy or Monique Scher. Reddy emphasizes the use of emotives in historical sources, highlighting the specific use of words and its connotations used to achieve certain emotional states. Scher builds on Reddy's concept, suggesting that the use of emotives constitutes a form of emotional practice. According to her, the success of such an emotional performance depends on the skill of both the performer and the recipients to interpret it. In our concrete case, the reporting on the famine, especially media use, newspaper articles, books, or of course also photos, emerges as crucial emotional practice. Possible success therefore depended both on the emotional involvement of Western readers in the fate of Soviet citizens and on their attitude towards Bolshevism. For example, we can clearly observe this approach in the previously mentioned book Russia Today and Tomorrow by Milyukov. It is noteworthy to mention in advance that the former politician, a member of the Russian Constitutional Democratic Party and Minister of Foreign Affairs in the provisional government of 1917, was one of the most well-known and influential Russian emigrants at the time and also widely acclaimed internationally successful publicist and historian. Much like many of his other writings, Russia Today and Tomorrow, published in English in London in 1922, offers a harsh critique of Bolshevik policies and advocates for a free, democratic Russia. The extensive chapter on the famine serves as a central part of his argument. In this section, Milyukov provides numerous detailed and explicit descriptions of the immense suffering of the people. In this context, he also emphasizes that despite foreign aid, by far not everyone benefited, and in many cases, assistance arrived simply too late. In conveying this, Milyukov employs highly emotive language, aiming to evoke as much emotional involvement as possible in his readers. I quote, "When will the help come? Will it not be too late? Will the starving people live long enough to be able to make use of it?" These questions are anxiously put to everyone who visits the famine-stricken area. The unvarnished truth is that there is no answer to that question, except that millions are sure to die before help can be given. But millions is a figure, and figures do not speak. Let me give you one single instance to bring home the whole meaning of that merciless truth. We are at Samara at the railway station. In the first-class dining room, there's exquisite food, everything you like to order: tasty white bread, steaks, pork chops, wine, ice cream, fruits, long tables covered with snow-white linen, flowers in vases of crystal. But this is for the commissars and speculators, the nouveau riche. A few feet away, there is that human cloaca known to us, with its unbearable stink of foul clothes and half-dead corpses, covered with black dust and clouds of flies, one mass of filth, rags, and refuse. Here, the image of the train serves as a metaphor for the inequality within Soviet society. While communist functionaries enjoy abundance and ironically travel within the confines of a protected bourgeois bubble, the common people starve unnoticed beside them. Rendered unrecognizable as human beings due to their misery and hunger, they resemble more abandoned animals. Milyukov thus exposes what he perceives as the hypocrisy of the Bolshevik leadership and emphasizes at the same time its cruelty, as it, in his view, disregards the miserable deaths of millions and forsakes its own people. To underscore this critique, Milyukov draws particular attention to the plight of children, as exemplified here, for instance. It is especially children that cannot wait and fall the first victims. Their mothers cannot bear their sufferings. They kill them. They drown them in the rivers. They die together in the smoke of their locked huts, or they leave them alone on the streets and before the doors of the Soviet institutions. In the streets of Samara, 200 children have been picked up daily, abandoned by their parents. Milyukov conveys here the profound despair that led mothers to view the murder of their children as a last resort. He reinforces the dramatic effect by listing various ways of killing the children or of committing suicide alongside them. However, as Milyukov underlines, Soviet childcare institutions were by no means lifesavers neither. I quote, "A Bolshevist report published in October 1921 states that the mortality in some cases is as high as 75%. Cholera, dysentery, and typhus prevail, in addition to the horrors of starvation." Consequently, Milyukov characterizes children's homes as antechambers of death. As it is characteristic for his argumentation in general, he underscores his observations with many concrete figures and official reports by Soviet authorities, giving them a special impression of authenticity. Milyukov's approach and descriptions align with numerous others, both from Western journalists and emigres. In this context, reports by correspondents of one newspaper were often cross-published in others, and they thereby discursively reinforced the shared narrative, also on a transnational level. For example, in the Paris-based French-speaking emigre newspaper Bulletin d'information pour la Russie, we find an article titled Eyewitness Reports, presenting the impressions of Jack Mills, an English correspondent for the Daily Herald, who also reported from Samara. It becomes immediately evident that Mills' description bears a striking resemblance to Milyukov's. The contrast established here, however, is not between the Bolshevik elite and the ordinary population, but between the privileged Western European citizen with access to white bread and crystal clear water and the suffering Russian population, the mother who, in despair, drowned her child in the Volga. Another recurring motif in many texts, as we have already seen with Milyukov, is the emphasis on the fact that not all those affected could benefit from foreign aid campaigns. Implicit in this narrative is also the idea that only a regime change could bring genuine relief. An illustrative example is the plight of the Jewish community in Ukraine, severely impacted by the famine even a year after international aid had begun. In Western Europe, it was primarily Russian and Ukrainian Jewish emigres who drew attention to their compatriots' fate, as seen, for instance, in La Tribune Juive. Established in Paris in December 1919 by Jewish members of the Constitutional Democratic Party, the anti-Bolshevik newspaper aimed to update its French-speaking, especially Jewish readers, on the situation of the Jewish minority in Soviet Russia, in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. From the outset, they also highlighted the issue of hunger among their Jewish compatriots. And still in October 1922, the newspaper reported on the situation in Ukraine, I quote, "Some newspapers have published reports that the famine in the Ukraine has been halted thanks to the new harvest and relief from America. Unfortunately, this information does not concern the Jewish population in the cities, where misery has never been so great as at present. The impoverished Jewish townspeople who had already sold all their property could not expect much from the harvest. Appeal to Jews everywhere, tell them that the Jewish population of the Ukraine is threatened with total extinction." In other articles, La Tribune Juive argued again and again that Bolshevism itself was an existential threat to Judaism. So I'm coming to my short conclusion. We see in this context, and we should emphasize once again that the journalists of La Tribune Juive, Pavel Milyukov, and with them many other democratic-minded emigres, were important voices for democracy and human rights in the years after 1917. They did not only warn of the dangers of a Bolshevik dictatorship, but also informed the European public about the massive grievances in the early Soviet state and recalled the suffering of huge parts of the population, including the tremendous tragedy of the famine of 1921. By collecting eyewitness accounts and different types of reports, they preserved important testimonies that commemorate the often anonymous victims. However, we have to bear in mind as well that this kind of texts had directly or indirectly propagandistic purposes. They were written from a specific perspective with a general focus on the darkest aspects of life under the Bolsheviks and the aim to evoke emotions, compassion, and at the same time abhorrence of Bolshevism. Therefore, we can speak with ready and share of a widely used emotional practice to achieve specific emotional states among the readers. Finally, many emigres did not only seek to arouse empathy, but also to contribute to the isolation, non-recognition, and overthrow of the Soviet government. However, this could not be achieved. On the contrary, the Soviet Union was diplomatically recognized by more and more states in the course of the 1920s. The voices of the emigrants, on the other hand, and their collected memories of the famine were gradually forgotten and are virtually unknown today. Interestingly, this also stands in contrast to sources on the Holodomor or to texts by later dissidents, such as the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, for instance. Therefore, for future research, rediscovering these sources could provide a particularly enriching perspective, to my opinion. I'm at the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alexandra. We will get back soon to your presentation, but now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Michał Kopczynski, who is a professor at the University of Warsaw in the History Department. In his research, he focuses on economic history, historical demography, and historical auxology. It is the science of human growth, physical development, and about the factors that influence it. In 2018, he published an important book in Polish language entitled Body and Economic History, Studies on Biological Standards of Living in Poland. He's also the author of another important book entitled People and Technology, Essays on the History of Industrial Civilization. And his presentation will also focus on human body in the context of famines. And the title of his presentation is Human Body Memory, Communicative Memory and Cultural Memory, the Case of Famines in Poland during the First and Second World Wars. So please.
Thank you. Can I speak from the... Sure. Do you hear me? Okay. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, famines were rare in the 20th century Europe. This is true at least for famines caused by natural disasters such as droughts, excessive rainfall, floods, or successive crop failures. The increase in agricultural productivity and dense transportation networks, together with better organization of state bureaucracy, made local famines related to natural causes easier to manage. This doesn't mean that famines have completely disappeared. The difference between the 20th century and the more distant past is that almost all cases of extreme food shortages in Europe in the 20th century were caused by war or political factors. In other words, European famines were man-made. War famines occurred also in the distant past, but it was not until the 20th century that military conflicts led to famines on a continental scale. Such famines took place both during the First and the Second World War. Efficient transportation networks built in the 19th century, which in peacetime allowed for regional specialization in agricultural production, were abruptly disrupted with the outbreak of conflicts between the big Allied powers. As a result, the urbanized societies of Western Europe, which used to import up to 50% of their nutrients, were threatened by malnutrition. The situation was no better for former food exporters in Southern and Eastern Europe. Mobilization of agricultural labor for the armies, together with wartime destructions, chaos, and economic policies aimed at exploring all the resources of occupied territories, inevitably led to food crisis, resulting in increased mortality and chronic malnutrition. Well, the purpose of this paper and research questions are here on the left panel. First, I would like to answer the question: were there really famines in Poland during 2 world wars? Secondly, how to measure their severity. The third question is how Poles remember the experience of wartime famines. And the fourth, why famine experience was forgotten in cultural memory. So start with some definitions. Definition 1, what is famine? According to Integrated Food Security Phase Calculations, IPC, for famine, there must be more than 20% of households must face complete lack of food. Starvation deaths are evident. Acute malnutrition prevalence exceeds 30%. So it's a very strong definition. If we apply this definition, phase 5 of IPC, to both the First World War realities and the Second World War realities in the Kingdom of Poland, that is the Russian part of Poland, there was no famine. There was only humanitarian emergency. Well, but humanitarian emergency means that more than 20% of households are devoid of food and must look for other sources of food, like charitable kitchens, or sell everything they have in order to acquire capital to buy food on the black market. Human body memory, what is it? Well, human body memory, because it's a lasting effect of famine visible on human body, that is stunting, disturbed growth process, susceptibility to chronic diseases in the later life. So, disturbed growth process, it's a short-term human body memory. Short-term because human body is plastic. And there is a growth curve for everybody of us. The sharpest growth takes place in the first 1,000 days after the conception. Then the velocity decreases and then increases dramatically at puberty. Nowadays, it's between the 13th and 15th year of age. In the past, it was a little bit later, 16 to even 18. And later there is a so-called catch-up growth period, a slow but prolonged period of growth. Well, so we can have a short time body memory and a long time body memory. A long time body memory is a stunted generation lasting 28 years, according to demographic definitions. Well, is it good or is it bad to be stunted? From the point of view of economic historian, it's bad. Because Robert Fogel, for instance, and his collaborator calculated that stunted people are less socially mobile. Stunted people are less effective intellectually. And it can be calculated into percents of GDP. So it can be a problem also in the long term. Well, the two following definitions, communicative memory is taken from Jan Assmann. Memory is shared by individuals with their contemporaries, and the time horizon is pre-generation, that is 80 years. And cultural memory, we all know that one important thing is that it's a memory that gives identity to a group. And firstly, and secondly, it's supported by institutionally. That's also important. Well, why I concentrate on stature? First of all, I must say I concentrate on stature as a sign of famine, because data are easily available. That's first of all. Secondly, human stature, as we all know, is determined by genetics. But the genetic potential can be fully realized only under the optimal environmental conditions. Environmental stresses that can prevent obtaining this optimal height are such as quantitative or qualitative deficiencies in food intake. Secondly, excessive physical effort in relation to food intake. Then excessive disease burden. And those stresses cause disturbances in growth process or may produce the stunted final height. There is a very well-known and acclaimed by medicine and by physical anthropologists, the so-called Barker hypothesis. David Barker was a doctor, but he was also epidemiologist from Britain, and he had such Calvinistic hypothesis. He said that the environmental conditions in the first 1,000 days after conception decide about future health. Not only final health, but also the susceptibility to chronic diseases such as coronary diseases, such as diabetes type 2 or strokes. It's a very Calvinistic hypothesis because, you know, as in Calvinistic creed, with the moment of conception, one is condemned or salvaged. It's the same as in Barker. In a more Catholic hypothesis, sins and good deeds are balanced against, and penance are balanced against at the end. So one have to make a lot of sins, eat too much, like me during this conference, in order to catch, say, diabetes type 2 or something like that. It's not the question of the first 1,000 days. So we'll check this hypothesis also. Short-term body memory shown here. This is a height of children from Warsaw by age. Children between in prepubertal age from 8 to 14, and there were 4 samples. The first sample was made measurement was made in 1924, and included children born between 1910 and 1916. So they were born just before the outbreak of the First World War or during the Third World War. As we can see, they were really stunted. Then the next generation, 1930, children that were born in the second half of the German occupation during the First World War, but their pubertal age was after the war in better environment. And we can see that the bars are a little bit taller than the first bars. The third generation, the third sample was from 1938, a period without war, and we can see that they are the tallest. And the last is from 1947. Children, the youngest children in this sample were born in 1939. We can see the influence of the Second World War, but this influence of the Second World War, the scar on the short-term body memory was not such deep as the First World War. So there was a difference. Let's look at long-term effects. Long-term effects, I researched long-term effects using a sample of prisoners incarcerated in Poland between the wars. And they were measured at the reception in the prisons. They were measured, they were weighted, and so on. And you can see here, the average height was 166.2, and this was the average for generation born between 1900 and 1904. That is, person that were at pubertal age during the worst period of the German occupation during the First World War. But children born during war were considerably taller. People born were considerably taller than those who were at pubertal age during the First World War. So that means that this Calvinistic Barker hypothesis is not, at least in the Kingdom of Poland, is not correct. This is visible also here on this line. Here we have this generation that was at pubertal and after pubertal age in 1918, the worst year when real wages were 16% of the average of the 1914. And then 168 centimeters. The same was in other samples, not only prisoners, but also soldiers and conscripts of the Polish army. And the same can be seen in the case of textile survey from 1957. It was for the textile industry. There was survey age by age. People were measured and weighted, and the results are here. This is the same trend. Well, so this was a statistical part. Cultural memory, forgotten hunger. Well, as far as the First World War is concerned, death, expulsion, and hunger were the most often mentioned characteristic of the period of the First World War. It was researched by Katarzyna Sierakowska in her book. She analyzed personal documents letters, diaries, memoirs from the Kingdom of Poland. Well, but it was a problem because in 1918 Poland regained its independence, and there was a question how to summarize this period of the war. Was it a traumatic event from the point of view of millions of persons, or maybe, well, a moment of great triumph, of regaining independence after 123 years? Well, just after the war in 1919, the parliament decided that the 3rd May, the anniversary of the Constitution of 1791, will be a national holiday. Well, it was the last great deed of the Polish Parliament, the Polish-Lithuanian Parliament of the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania. But it was not enough. It was not enough. In late 1926, Józef Piłsudski, the Marshal of Poland, the commander of Polish legions and Polish activists during this First World War, had decided that the unofficial holiday will be set at November 11th, the day of the armistice. In fact, he could decide the date from late October to, well, November 14th. But he decided this armistice because it was not, the date was not involved in Polish internal politics. In 1937, the Independence Day was instituted as a national holiday. Then it was banned by the communists, but the remembrance of this holiday remained after the Second World War. But let's look at the Second World War. I return a little bit here. I would like to quote Jan Bogdanowicz, a renowned Polish pediatrician who made 4 of those samples of children I showed you. And commenting the results, he wrote, "The last war, as far as Warsaw children are concerned, didn't have such a negative effect on their height and body mass as the previous one. The children suffered losses mainly from German atrocities, roundups, murders, bombings, and etc., and not from hunger, thanks to the excellent self-defense of the society. The comparison of the data from 1930 to 1947 shows only a slowing down of the growth rate, and not such a calamity like this First World War." Well, hunger is also mentioned in many diaries and memoirs from the Second World War. Some descriptions are really deep, emotionally deep. For the first time, I realized what does it mean to be hungry when I read Stanisław Rembek's diary. He wrote about how he was hungry in 1942 or something like that. Well, but hunger never became, even in those personal recollections, never became the most important feature. The most important feature was scare of death and terror. And in fact, the terror, the victims of the terror of the German occupation were memorized in monuments, tables, and so on. Films, not the hunger. Well, there was no hunger, I told you. There was nothing to memorize, one can say. From the point of view of the new communist government, the most important thing was to look for a new beginning, and this new beginning for communists was July 22nd, the day of the installation of the third communist government and its manifesto and so on. So they were interested in July 22nd. But when we look in popular culture and in the Polish culture of memory, we can find a paradox, because the hunger of the First World War fell into oblivion totally. The hunger or food crisis of the Second World War remained in popular culture. And what remained from it? The figure of a smuggler. In 1941, in Bulletin Informacyjny, a clandestine newspaper, it was written, during the previous war, that was the First War, the so-called smuggler didn't enjoy a good reputation in society. Today, we all treat small traders who deliver foodstuffs to cities from distant rural areas as heroes of sorts, saving Polish cities from total starvation with their courage and cunning. This is the photo from the film Band Songs in 1947. In the background, there was a quite popular during the occupation song. It was Now is War. For living, you must trade. And here are these petty smugglers. They are eating sausage and drink self-made vodka, and well, they are rushed by German soldiers. But those German soldiers are susceptible to corruption, and they took some vodka, they took some sausages, they took some money, and went out. It's a paradox, because the film is from 1947. It popularizes or enters this positive figure of a petty trader, a smuggler, into Polish popular culture, and is at the same time is the first year of the so-called war for trade declared by the Polish communist government that resulted in suppressing all private retailing. And but the figure of smuggler, positive figure of smuggler, remained in Polish communicative, at least, memory, and re-emerged in the last decade of communism. Imagine such a situation. I'm old man. I'm finishing. I'm old man, so I can tell something from my own memories. It was Monday, December 14, 1981, the first day of the martial law, the second day of the martial law. The martial law was declared on Sunday. And I remember just before 8 a.m., a knock to the door. Who may knock to the door? Secret police or something like that? No, it was Mr. Stanisław from Skierniewice. He killed a pig on Saturday, prepared a lot of meat, and then Jaruzelski declared war on Sunday. The trains were moving, but he was forbidden to travel. So he took rucksacks full of meat, went to the train as the only one traveler, went to Warsaw. And he told us that, well, as a child, I smuggled meat to Warsaw under Germans. So it was quite difficult. It cannot be more difficult now. And it was the beginning of the decade of the heroic small smuggler with rucksack full of meat. And, well, Stanisław was a male, but majority were female. Imagine a situation in the Department of History, library at the Department of History, mid-1980s. An old, small lady with 2 bags and a rucksack full of meat. They just, all books out, and meat on the table, and all female members of the, because meat is for female are really know meat. Men are not specialists in it. And all of them are looking and dividing the pieces of meat. Yes. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
I would be really happy to hear more of your personal stories, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. So now I would like to introduce our third speaker, online speaker. I hope she's with us. She is Bargiashli Vyasaramahacharya. I know it was not a correct pronunciation, but I hope she will forgive me. She is a first-year PhD student at Goethe University, Frankfurt, where she teaches Indian literature and war and famine studies. Her research interests include memory and famine studies, Anglophone and post-colonial literatures, media, cultural and communication studies. And through her research, she aims to address the question, why memories of famines remain forgotten, how can they be made memorable, and how can they be commemorated? And the title of her presentation is Framing Memory, Tracing Shifts in Memorability of the Bengal Famine 1943. So, Bargiashli, I hope you are with us. And
yes.
Yeah, okay, so the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very
floor.
much. Thank you very much. That was indeed the right pronunciation. Thank you so much. A very good afternoon. I apologize due to personal reasons. I could not be there in person, but a huge thanks to all the organizers for the efforts, and they've been a great support. Today, I will be presenting the paper titled Framing Memory, Tracing Shifts in Memorability of the Bengal Famine 1943. The main question I explore in this paper is to trace how certain memories that had remained subverted shift from being unmemorable to becoming memorable and having active discourses. I focus on certain collective memories that had remained forgotten for decades and how they came to have active discourses in the public, and Bengal famine is my case study. To give a brief historical context, Bengal is a region in eastern India. It was British Empire's first and largest province because of its innumerable resources, land fertility, location that enabled port access for trading. But however, by the end of colonization, Bengal had been impoverished, had been partitioned, and had been through several famines. In fact, author and parliamentarian Shashi Tharoor claims that there had been over 30 million deaths under the British rule as a result of famine. Other scholars claim that just during colonization, there had been up to 60 million famine deaths. Famine of 1943 is one among the many famines. Occurring amidst World War II, the famine caused 3 million deaths. The price of rice, which is the staple dish in the region, was soaring, and the streets of Calcutta, the capital of Bengal, was piling with the starving people looking for food and the dead. Generally, famines garnered less attention in India as well as globally. As historian Lizzie Collingham, researching on World War II and the hunger situation across the globe, puts it, famines lacked drama. Death by famine, a slow, vast, unobtrusive nature of death by starvation, is not exciting unlike the massacres that are blood-stirring and prints indelible images on the mind. Famine deaths only seek attention when the crows, rats, dogs, vultures get at it. This quiet nature of death, she claims, is the reason why those who died of hunger are largely forgotten today. Though famines in India garnered less attention, during 1943, Bengal famine had been popularized as man-made famine. Similar to Collingham's claim, though the famine had begun early on in 1943, it reached the media only during mid-1943 when the corpses started piling up on the streets. Famines were generally viewed within natural calamities context, that is, arising out of flooding, drought, crop failures, etc. However, in contrast, 1943 famine had become controversial, arising out of neglect, denial, improper grain distribution, and criticizing the colonial government. The government appointed Famine Inquiry Commission, after a year of thorough investigation, concluded that the excessive rainfall, harvest failure leading to shortage of grains, improper management of goods, black market trading and hoarding, and the fall of Burma that blocked imports and trade routes to India led to the famine of 1943. Though the memory had been active during the period, the emerging nationalist movement in India, followed by the Indian independence, overshadowed the memory of the famine. The official narrative remained uncontested, at least significantly. Though there were a few regional, that is, Bengali narratives, films on the memory, they were rather scarce. Until Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen introduced the concept exchange entitlements. He disputed the Famine Inquiry Commission's findings, claiming that there was indeed no shortage, and the wartime policies, such as denial policies that denied boats and rice to deter the Japanese from attacking, obstructed the trade, and destabilized regions that were only connected by water. Furthermore, going against the grain of conventional method of food availability decline, a concept commonly used to assess famines, which calculated the food available per person against total harvest, he introduced exchange entitlement, which argued that it is not the shortages that lead to famines, but the inability to afford food. It is the situation where a laborer is unable to exchange his services for economic gain to acquire food. Due to war inflation, the prices of commodities were high, and the wage increase was provided only to those working in the war industries. The same was not reflected among other labor groups. This created an imbalance in the economy. It provided buying power only to certain classes and disabled other classes to afford food, therefore leading to famine. Though this socio-economic approach spiraled famine studies in assessing other famines and applicability of the concept, as well as several criticisms, the memory of the Bengal famine, however, still remained unmemorable. In 2010, after several decades, Madhushree Mukherjee published Churchill's Secret War, a re-narrativized memory narrative of the famine, where she starkly criticized colonial government under Churchill's leadership. Her entire narrative focuses on outlining the colonial government, especially Churchill's racist ideology toward Indians, leading to neglect and denial of imports that led to shortages and famine, and therefore the 3 million deaths. In tracing the shifting memorability of the famine, I believe after this publication, the memory of the famine was reactivated. If not immediately, at least it initiated a memory discourse. Ever since, the memories of the famine not only activated scholarly attention, but also national as well as international attention. Churchill's statue in London and Canada were vandalized with red paint, and "he was a racist" was written on it. This led me toward analyzing what activated these memories. How did the memories that had remained unmemorable for several decades suddenly have active public discourse? How did this publication mobilize subverted memories to becoming active again? To understand this better, framing, the concept from memory studies, is about selection and salience. It is the process through which a communication source constructs and defines a social or political issue for its audience. It makes a piece of information more noticeable, meaningful, and therefore memorable. It defines to its audience what is at issue. In further analyzing news frames, which is derived from framing concept, Entman remarks that the presence or absence of certain keywords, stock phrases, stereotyped images, sources of information, and sentences that provide thematically reinforcing cluster of facts or judgments. and that it can have psychological effects, the news frames, which means that it can initiate belief change and have persuasive effects on the audience, urging them to react on issues. Therefore, borrowing the framing concept from communication studies into memory studies, I argue that memories, especially those that remained unmemorable, became memorable when they are framed within particular narrative frames. Representing less familiar events within the frame of more familiar ones can enable articulation and comprehension of hitherto unarticulated experiences. Hence, I claim that framing memory as a methodology is then the act of consciously framing memories into narrative frames that are popular and active with the intention to make them memorable again. Certain mnemonic communities remediate these memories within these frames to enhance their memorability. This strategy enables recognition, relevance, and initiates the memory discourse. For instance, I believe that the famine was earlier represented in the cause frame, which aimed at establishing the causes for the famine, since it was rather unconventional. Famines that were generally understood to arise out of natural calamities context changed since this famine had socio-economic context. The narrative and scholarly attention were diverted toward understanding causes of the famine, be it colonial, political, black market trading, etc. However, when they were re-narrativized and represented, these memories were placed within perpetrator frame. Though the causes still remained similar, the focus was laid on the political leader, as the title and book cover suggests, or the genocide frame that the narrative constantly aims to suggest. The author uses several remarks and draws similarities among other genocides and the Bengal famine, among Churchill and Hitler, suggesting it was like a genocide. Therefore, this narrative became controversial, especially in Britain, where Winston Churchill is celebrated as a national hero. Several debates, criticism drew attention toward the book and the issue, especially for how it was structured. These were also remediated in news and social media with several documentaries, videos, etc. While for several decades, there were very few of any documentaries, videos, or scholarly attention in this matter, lately there has been immense number of videos, documentaries, attention given to the issue. Over time, the narrative had become public knowledge. The remediation reinforced the idea, if not academically, at least in public. For instance, there was a scientific research conducted on the soil to test the soil moisture. The research committee concluded that the 1943 famine was not caused due to less or more rainfall, that it is not due to natural calamities, rather it was due to other factors. After which, the headlines of several tabloids associated Churchill with the famine. But what stands out is though the research committee did not explore the other factors, nor make any references to Churchill, they instead referred to sense findings of the war and inflation with the already ongoing or incited discourse of the famine. The cause of the famine was directly associated with Churchill. In fact, during the Black Lives Matter movement, after a couple of vandalism on his statues, Churchill's legacy was under reassessment with constant public and scholarly debates and popular news debates. Though a direct association to famine has not been established, Churchill's legacy, his dislike towards the subjects of his empire, is addressed, established, as well as accepted. In fact, in the National Portrait of Gallery in London, a plaque placed under one of Churchill's portraits, if not admits, definitely addresses the issue of the famine and the possibility of Churchill's mismanagement. And this has been a latest development. This suggests that while on one hand, framing memories as a methodology can be used as a strategy by mnemonic communities to reactivate the memories of the forgotten past. It can also, for scholars, enable understanding and analyzing of shifting memorabilities of collective memories. Though framing can also have negative consequences, and there is a possibility of false memories being mediated to mnemonic communities, which also I explore in my thesis. However, I believe that framing memories, as I refer to them, is a conscious effort or a strategy employed by mnemonic communities in order to activate the memorability of forgotten events. It is a methodology that can enhance memorability, mobilize mnemonic communities inside discourse, and has the ability to persuade communities to act and react to forgotten and violent pasts. I argue that memories that had been unmemorable became memorable when famine narrative was placed within a genocide frame. This framing methodology was employed, um, drew attention not only nationally but also internationally. For several decades, or even so far, most of even in India, the national memory of the Bengal famine was inexistent. That is, it was not present in history textbooks, or there were very few scholarly attention, which seem to have changed at least publicly, and is a growing field also academically. Framing memories as a methodology can be used also to offer multiple perspectives and the ability to reassess and articulate the past. For instance, to trace the latest developments, the memory initiation of the Bengal famine has led to other famines being reassessed with similar colonial, political, and lately genocidal frames, leading to development in the field of post-colonial and famine studies. Famines are being widely accepted, especially in the colonized part, as a genocide that were avoidable tragedies, but were consciously made due to racism and other neglect toward the colonies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bargashli, and thank you for our speakers as well for the excellent presentations. I will open the discussion soon, but before I do that, I would like to very briefly comment on your presentations and maybe ask some questions. I think that we heard a very coherent and chronologically arranged panel, which covered the whole period from the First World War until the end of the Second World War. And these presentations, in a way or another, were in dialogue with each other. So they drew attention to different aspects of hunger, famine, and memory. And what they had in common was, on the one hand, that they start from the premise that human agency was always behind the famines. In the 20th century, it is already clear, or it is already indicated in the title of the panel. So we speak about wartime famines. So as Professor Kopczynski mentioned, these famines were all man-made famines. Yeah, and there was also reference in Bargashli's presentation to Amartya Sen, who argues that in the 20th century, when the civilization, motorization capacities are so advanced, and the transport and the distribution of food should not be in principle a problem, and when it happens, it's always a human-induced thing, and it's always a direct or indirect result of human decisions or economic processes. So this is clear. And what was also common in your presentation, that you all argued that we cannot really speak about collective memory of the famines. And this is a question I would like to explore a little bit more. So now I would re-articulate the arguments that have appeared in your presentation. And my idea is that it would be really good if you could respond to each other's arguments. Yes, so the main question is why there is no collective memory of the famine or the hunger. And one possible answer is that the agency behind famine is very difficult to localize. So, for example, while in the case of the Holocaust, the perpetrators of the killings in the gas chambers can be identified quite precisely, then the agency behind the famine is human, but on the other hand, it's somehow hidden between administrative decisions and some economic phenomena, right? So maybe this is one of the possible answers. The second possible answer why hunger and famine does not have a collective memory is that it is a narrative problem. So death by famine lacks drama. It is all about slowly passing away, slowly fading away. So it's really difficult to find a narrative framework or a literary genre for the storytelling about famine. As far as I know, there has not been literary adaptation of the Ukrainian Holodomor, except for the Yellow Prince written by Vasil Barka in 1963, but it was 30 years later after Holodomor. And we also saw that in other cases, narratives about famine or hunger or Holodomor can be highly ideological in nature, and these narratives can be also hijacked. For example, for propaganda purposes, as we saw in the presentation of Alexandra. And they were also somehow connected with emotional practices, right? So the question is, how can we unpack this kind of text to get through the ideological barriers and get to the experience of hunger or the representation of hunger. The third possible answer why the famine is absent in collective memory is a problem of competing memories or the already existing memory frameworks. We saw this in the presentation of Professor Kopczynski. Yeah, it was about the collective memory patterns in Poland, which were established after the First World War. And it is the question of interpretation, how we interpret the First World War as a triumph, as a moment of regaining independence, or as a moment when can we remember the trauma. And these are like competing with each other ways how to remember this historical period. But it was also evident in the presentation of Bargyasli, right? These competing memories. I was very pleased to hear your lecture, which focused on the Bengal famine, because it takes us a little bit out of our Eurocentric position. And I'm sure that this historical event is very little known for European public and even for European historians. Here in this case, we also see that this reframing the Bengal famine as a genocide, it also contradicts the already existing memory framework. To put in other words, it is not easy to frame Churchill as a perpetrator, since he was a celebrated war hero after the Second World War. So in this sense, framing the Bengal famine as a genocide, it subverts this image, and it has a kind of revolutionary potential, which endangers the already existing forms of collective memory. So the question could be for you, how do you see the memory of the Bengal famine in the context of these competing forms of memory? And the fourth argument why famine or hunger is not present in the collective memory is also the problem articulated by Professor Kopczynski, the problem of science, the problems of materiality of memory. We heard in the previous panels that memory needs a kind of physical, objective dimension on which it can rely, triggers that somehow motivate memory. And we heard that Professor Kopczynski argued that beyond communicative and cultural memory, there is another form, the human body memory, right? But I wonder to what extent this human body memory is legible. So to what extent we can read it, because you also used like big data, statistics, and probably if you look at two bodies which one survived the famine and the other one not, probably these signs are not evident, and these are not possible to read them, right? So maybe it could be the fourth reason why we cannot remember these events, the lack of the materiality, or the lack of the signs and the triggers. Yeah, so these are the main arguments, and I would really love to hear your reflections about these questions. Would you like to do it now, or let's gather more questions? What do you think? So, okay, I would give you now the chance to answer these questions, and after we will gather more questions from the audience. Who would like to start? Ladies first. Ladies first. Okay, so we reduce the options to two. Bargesli or Alexandra?
I guess I can start.
Okay,
Well,
perfect. Thank you.
Regarding why famine narratives are not sort of popularized or officialized, I guess especially in my case, I can say the class issue plays a very important role, because especially in famine situations, the first ones to perish would be or the most likely people to perish would be the landless peasants and farmers, who have, I think, less resources to articulate these into narratives. And for the other classes instead, or administrative governments, or other bystanders, if you would like to call it, for them to address such events would mean that they are also implicated in famine, because definitely the second one hears of a shortage, the one who has economic power tends to acquire more resources, therefore leaving the landless, the non-economic classes with nothing. Therefore, for them to talk about this would be accepting the guilt or the implications, which is quite hard to do given the situations. And I guess how it can be spoken about is to deviate from the official forms of narrativization to non-official forms, to maybe not into a particular novel or a narrative or a scholarly work, but to see how, since they come from a relatively lower class, how they communicate, how they intend to remember these, maybe through orality, maybe through, especially now with the media reach, through social media or other forms that they can access and speak about their experiences or their generational experiences, to break the silence, rather than claiming or rather than demanding to do it in the official narrative form, I believe. That makes sense.
Yes, thank you. Alexandra?
Concerning the collective memory and why it's not part of it, especially this famine of 1921, I think, first of all, the Soviet Union had no interest at all to commemorate it. I mean, it was especially humiliating in their eyes for them, because they needed help from America, the big enemy ideologically. So there is really absolutely no interest, I think, to commemorate this from the official Soviet side. Concerning the emigres in Western Europe, it's also difficult for them because we also have to keep in mind they were in an outsider position as well. They were a minority. They were emigres. They had a lot of material survival fights to daily survival, and often they published also to gain money actually. Their agency was limited for sure. Even for someone like Milyukov, who was really one of the most famous ones, he was in exile. He was not the big politician anymore. He had been in Russia. So they always had also to think how they could maybe fit in the discourse. So I think for emigres, anti-Bolshevism, except from, of course, they were also personally convinced and personally anti-Bolshevik, but I think in addition, it was also for them a certain strategy of integration to the majority of society. And especially in the first years after the October Revolution, this worked quite well. There was this common anti-communist feeling, except from the communists themselves, of course. But when we look at the case of France, for instance, they lose their position and influence more and more. It was easier maybe for the far right-wing emigres, but for the left-wing democratic ones, they were in a double outsider position, especially in France. So there was almost no agency for them. I think they tried, but there were other voices much louder than them, especially then in the 1930s. Concerning the question how to unpack these texts, I think it's always important to explain the context, to accept these texts in their ambiguity and complexity. They are memories, but they are also kind of propaganda texts. And I think we just have to show this and show especially the emotionalizing strategies behind, but more or less they are based on reality. I mean, of course they want to influence the reader, and we can focus on this, how they did it with special word use, etc. But I think it's hard to totally unpack them. I mean, we just can get closer to them, I think. Yeah.
Well, excuse me for being a little bit chaotic, because it's a lot of questions to think about. Famine lacks drama. That's right. But Margaret told us today in the morning that such not dramatic famines like Irish, they have a way to make it material and to memorialize it. The same with Holodomor. A little bit more controversial, because in these two cases, the perpetrator is self-evident. The English, maybe not perpetrators, but at least the idols, the idle liberals, terrible idle liberals. Then Russia, in the case of Holodomor. Finnish experience is interesting, because this is the last big in Central Europe, last big famine in Central Europe. It was this Finnish and Scandinavian famine, 67, 68. I'm interested. Have you ever found any memorization of Finnish famine 1696-97. 1696 to 1697, because in historiography, Finnish historiography, nationalistic historiography, it was the most memorized famine because it was caused by those bloody Swedes. Because in 68 it's difficult, liberals, but those liberals were also Finns, or Swede Finns, so something like this. So it depends. Sometimes famine is very dramatic because we can show perpetrators. And in fact, the story is about the perpetrator and not those crowds that are dying calmly. Because famine is less difficult for the rulings, for the authorities, than the fear of famine. Fear of famine finished with the French Revolution. Irish famine ended with 2 million of victims. Competing memories, yes, I suppose it's important because when, well, the moments of glory, regaining independence or victory at war, we must remember about glory and not about, well, we can remember heroes, dead heroes, okay, but it must be a small, well-defined military group. It's easier to grasp and to memorize than those unnamed victims. In the Second World War, the famine was less severe than during the first, in Poland at least, but well, the war was not won. Even in this Polish army that fought under the Soviets, they had no triumphs, military triumphs. All battles they fought, they lost. In fact, so it was nothing to celebrate. So Polish memory of the Second World War is a typical victimized memory, but it's easier to grasp military victims than civilian victims. And the materiality, yes, that's right, because I'm rather short because of my genetic potential and not any famine in my childhood. So it's the variability of stature in humans is much greater. The ordinary variability, 6.5 centimeters, is much greater than changes, intergenerational changes that are some 2 to 4 centimeters. So it's not easy to grasp. But I used height just to compare, just to have a tool to compare the First and the Second World War. That was, first of all, it was for me important. And I'm rather critical towards the Barker hypothesis that all cardiovascular diseases now are the consequences of, say, hardship in the Stalinist era. I don't think so. But your questions are, yes, I might think about it a little bit longer, so sorry for this chaotic answer.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. In the meantime, I got information that Irina Skubi from Zoom would like to have a comment, so please do that.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I was really happy to join online, and while hearing like this panel and comments, I was also looking forward just to add something like from my understanding of the comments that just Gabor mentioned about the lack of materiality. And I was like wondering if it's not only just a lack of materiality, which is indeed true when we are speaking about famines and the lack of famine materiality in museums, but in fact we have to understand why we have this lack of materiality, and this comes from the survival practices, the panels that we will have following this one. when we have to understand why people have lost all of their material possessions, goods, valuables like earrings and other valuables that they could trade at the markets or in Torksins, which is a very special case regarding the Holodomor in Ukraine. It was a special network of state retail stores which were aimed to specifically extract those valuables from people and give them exchange food, grain, or just bread. So that's why we are lacking this materiality in famine museums. That's why we do not see these objects. That's why they were lost, and only these traces of the memories of these objects are present in the memories, in the testimonies, and that's why like we have to deal with this lack of physical materiality, but the presence of this materiality in memory and oral history. And I guess like this history of famines is very specific because it helps us understand why this is happening and understand this how the famines evolve as a process and understands its consequences. So families and generations lost their connections with the previous family members, with the histories of these objects that were running through family history because of the famine, specifically because of survival practices and because of the state policies which were imposing and causing these famines. And I guess this explains us a lot about this lack of physical presence of material objects, but they are present in our like oral histories and testimonies. Yeah, just wanted to address this, that I feel that's important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Runa. It was a really important comment. Do you hear me? Yeah. Okay, thank you. So now I would like to open the discussion, and I wonder, do you have any questions, comments?
Thank you very much for your interesting talks. I have a question to Alexandra. I would like to ask you, how would you evaluate the value of these ego documents you mentioned? Because you said it's propaganda, but can we still use them? Are there distortions? And then I have a comment for Professor Kupczynski. You mentioned these statistics. What I'm missing is actually the Jewish population, which was in fact starving in the ghettos, especially here in the Warsaw ghetto. The starvation started in 1940, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, there were about 100,000 people who actually died. And the problem is they don't appear in the statistics because they were killed, all of them, 99% of all Jews. But I think all over Poland there were Jews in the ghettos starving. So I think kind of we should consider them somehow. And also the people, many Poles, thousands of Poles in the concentration camps were starving. So that's maybe the reason, and I think that would lower the bars if we consider them kind of in the statistics. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe let's gather more questions. You will have more time to think about them. Marguerite?
First of all my compliments for all the speakers and also the great moderation and the points brought up there. I think, well, with basically the replies that you gave to Gabor's questions, I thought was really, really interesting. I have a question for Bagarashi, and I'm really intrigued by the Bengal famine because there's often that links are made also to the colonial situation in Ireland, but also because there's of course a long history of famines that actually preceded the Bengal famine. I was actually thinking of the Great Irish Famine of 1876 and 1878 in Madras, I think, if I'm correct, and Orissa famine of 1866. And I was actually wondering, because I have no idea to what extent people actually wrote critically about this or kept memories about these two famines. Because what I've been able to read about them is sometimes critical reports, for example, that were written by, you could say, Anglo-Indian administrators, or well, basically people coming from the empire. Also sometimes actually being very critical of the imperial relief works that were sort of being set up. And Charles Trevelyan, of course, is an infamous name that's connected to basically famines in Scotland, Ireland, but also India, where he was also working as one of those colonial administrators. But basically, are there sort of, is there any sort of material that memorizes those other famines that actually come from the people, the communities who suffered from the famines? I think that's one question. And another one is were they also remediated, these other famines, when people were talking about the Bengal famine of 1943? So that's my question.
Yeah, thank you. And we have one more question there.
Hi, I have a question for Bhagyashri as well. So I was wondering how the current narrative fits into the framing of the 1943 Bengal famine. You mentioned denial policies, a scorched earth, like especially with India and Bangladesh. Like, how do they perceive the denial? It can be viewed as a denial policy with regards to the destruction of, I think the UN said it was 300,000 metric tons of food in Odessa and Ismail. The entire food transportation network is, as another aspect of the denial policy is destruction of the transport ships. That is actively being done in Odessa through Iranian drones and Russian cruise missiles. And there is also increasingly countries, as a result of this instability, they have to view Russia as the monopoly on food for the world, or the breadbasket of the world, because their competitors are currently subject to colonial reconquest. They want to be reintegrated into the Soviet Empire. And I was wondering if there is any pushback on that. Do they see this, or do they just not? Are they indifferent, apathetic?
Okay, thank you. I think this is time to answer the questions. So first, Alexander, please.
I don't would speak in this context of ego documents. I would rather say these are political essays or newspaper articles, but compilations maybe of many ego documents and comments on it. But and it's, of course, they are not pure propaganda. They have maybe propagandistic intentions behind, but in this sense it's very complex, because finally it's rather positively. I mean, there were voices for democratic Russia. So how to evaluate them? I think they are important sources for discourse analysis, and they are parts of a counter discourse to the official Soviet discourse. So already in this sense, they are interesting to evaluate, even if, it's very hard to say how influential they were in the end or they were not. But to get a feeling for the contemporary discourse, I think they are very interesting documents in the end.
Thank you. Professor Kopczynski.
What with the Jews? That's right. Famine in Warsaw Ghetto is well documented, not in terms of statistics. That's always a problem during famines, how many people starved to death, how many died because they caught an epidemic disease. But it's very well documented. There is a group of Jewish doctors that made experiments on those starving people, and one of them survived and found the documentation hidden somewhere in the ghetto, and it was published in 1948 as an essay on hunger, illness. It was maybe not so well documented, but much more dramatic description than the description or the research that was supervised by Ansel Keys in Minnesota in 1944, because there was also a starvation experiment that was organized because the Americans thought that Europeans will be in general so starved that one must understand how to feed up people after such long starvation. That was the genesis of. But I skipped in this description of the Second World War food situation. I skipped those most dramatic places like Warsaw, Łódź, ghetto that starved, truly starved, because they were closed. Other smaller ghettos, like in outside Warsaw, Otwock or something, were semi-closed, so it was easier to smuggle food. I skipped concentration camps, labor camps, even POW camps that had the same situation. I just concentrated on free people, or free, they were not really free, but not in camps. So that's all. One short comment on Bengal famine. I had a student who wrote his MA on Bengal famine it was traumatic dissertation, 430 pages for MA when average is 100. And it's fine. It's interesting to compare British policy toward Bengal and say toward the hunger crisis in Greece, 41-42, because there was negotiated food transport on neutral ships to Greece from Egypt. And at the same time, there was 1 million Indian soldiers in the British army fighting, and there was no reaction. So this is a important point in this genocide interpretation.
Yeah, thank you. And now Bargyashli.
Yes, thank you. The first question is, there were several famines. Unfortunately, what remains is the official narratives that is definitely written by the Anglo-Indian, the official colonial governance. I believe that any memories that were mediated were unfortunately mediated only orally. And since there were so many famines under the colonial rule, it simply became one among the many. However, what I see, especially lately, is once the famine discourse had been initiated, or once they began speaking about famines and their association with colonial governance, as a remediation, as in like this Bengal famine of 1943 that had been controversial, provided the agency also to speak about other famines. For instance, the 1770 famine, where 10 million lives were lost. They do write about it or use the current theoretical framework to reassess the little documents that are available to see how can they be avoided, or what could have caused them, or what were the famine relief strategies that were undertaken, and to either further criticize them or in certain areas also to accept them. For instance, in very minute areas, the self-governance also provided the food grains, and they sort of maintained or tried to avoid casualties, which obviously the colonial government failed to do so. So such comparisons are coming up. definitely, I believe that this has provided the agency to rethink of other two famines. For instance, the last two books I showed in my presentation are the latest books that have come out. They assess not just the famine of 1943, but two other or three other similar famines to at the same wavelength with the same or similar concepts to see how can they be reassessed since only official narrative remains. If that answers your question. And secondly, how, if I get the question right, the narratives of framing and the present tension with Russia and how do they see this or do they see this? I think the discourse of the famine discourse only began, I would say, like 1 decade earlier. So until then, this had been widely absent or very, very, very minimally mediated, only probably in Bengali region. But as a nation, I think India has started to rethink or consider or remember Bengal famine only in the last decade once this discourse has been started. So since the scholarship is still so new, I believe that with the present scholarship, the focus is still looking on the outside. That is, looking on the colonial governments, looking on other political leaders to see how they could have caused the famines. I believe famines are complicated situations where not just outsiders, there would be certain classes of the inside, that is, the local, certain classes also involved in, if not causing, definitely probably worsening the situation for example, the elite classes or the war industries that, especially in India during 1943, were reaping profit. Therefore, I believe it is still not reached the point where it can self-reflect, that is, to point fingers within, to properly, holistically analyze the famine to see if there were any other implications, any other guilt. It is still in the phase of pointing outward. Therefore, I believe they wouldn't or they do not see this question, or if I get the question right.
Translating you what I hear from the audience. It was a nice answer. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank for all of our speakers today for these excellent presentations. I would love to continue the discussion, but unfortunately we do not have more time. So thank you very much.